What if I told you that there was a player in the G League averaging 20 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, shooting 43% from the field, 36% from 3. And now what if I introduced player B, who has played the same amount of games in the G League this year and is averaging 9 points, 4 rebounds, 2 assists, only shooting 34% from the field and 11% from 3. Player A, you might have guessed, is Bronny James, averaging 20 points so far in the G League. Player B is Kevin McCullough Jr. of the Westchester Knicks. He was picked number 56 in this year's draft, just one after Bronny. Now, the point of this video isn't to compare Bronny James to Kevin McCullough Jr., and it's really not even to compare Bronny James to other players the Lakers may have selected. But with all the headlines that have come out the last week, and mainly the video with Stephen A. Smith and LeBron James, and really just all the headlines that have been created mainly by Stephen A. Smith, it's worth talking about if Bronny James belongs in the NBA. I think pretty much everyone can agree on the fact that if Bronny wasn't LeBron James' son, he would not have been drafted last year. Now, I'm not saying Bronny would have never been drafted in general, but if he was not LeBron James' son, he would have stayed one more year in college, potentially turned into a better NBA prospect. But I think we can all agree that the reason Bronny was drafted this year to the Lakers was because of LeBron. And so that's not the point I'm trying to debate. What I am trying to debate is, now that he's here, does Bronny James belong in the NBA? Now, first we got to determine what it means to actually belong in the NBA. And I'm going to count the G League as part of the NBA. It's all of professional basketball in the US. There's 60 guys that get drafted most years into the NBA. There are not 60 spots available, hence why the G League exists, to develop guys mainly in the second round. So I'm going to count the NBA and G League together. So when I refer to the NBA, I'm counting the G League. But what it means to belong in the NBA really depends on where you're drafted. If you are drafted first overall, like Zachary Rees-Sachet this past year, you are going to have way different expectations than someone drafted 55th in Bronny's case. If you were the first pick, you are going to have way bigger of a runway. If you struggle, you will get second opportunities. You will get third opportunities. You may even get fourth opportunities. If you are the 55th pick, you may not even get one opportunity. You may never see the NBA court. So determining how you quote unquote belong really depends on where you're drafted. And in Bronny's case, he was drafted near the end of the second round, pick number 55. If he was picked in the first round, if he was picked 17th, the first round pick that the Lakers had, where they picked Dalton Knecht, if he was picked 17th, this is a whole different conversation. But the fact that he's picked 55th, that changes things, and that changes his expectation. Because second round picks are an interesting discussion when you talk about the NBA draft. Let's take a look at every single player drafted in the second round this past year. Now, if you follow the NBA draft at all, you know 2024 was a really bad draft class. But these were all 28 players selected in the second round. The Suns and 76ers, they didn't have a second round pick. So we got 28 players in total selected. 3 of those players we haven't seen. They have played overseas. We're not going to count them yet. Again, we're not judging these players just off of 3/4 of their first NBA season. But of the remaining 25 players that have seen minutes either in the NBA or the G League, Bronny right now ranks 18th in minutes played in the NBA. Now, that's not the best statistic because minutes played, especially by second round picks, a lot of these guys are getting garbage time minutes. A lot of these guys are getting minutes just kind of based on maybe injuries or other factors that their team has. So that might not be the best way to compare Bronny to the other second round picks this last year. But this is where we can look at the G League, because a majority of these players have played at least one game in the G League. 5 of the remaining 25 have not played in the G League. But of the 20 remaining players that have played at least one game in the G League, Bronny ranks 5th in points per game. Now, as we all know, points are far from the best way to evaluate a player. There are plenty of players that don't rely on scoring to make an impact. So this isn't necessarily an argument to say Bronny is the 5th best player of this list. This is just some context, because I think context matters in this discussion. But we can look at it from just an eye test standpoint as well. Of the 25 players that have played from this second round, there have been a few notable names. Quentin Post, the big for the Warriors, he's had some moments for them and has actually started getting rotation minutes more recently, so he would be considered a good second round pick. We just saw Cam Spencer, Pat Spencer's brother, played at UConn last year. We just saw him going at it with Kevin Durant, so we'll give him a shout out. And then you have the guys that have played the most minutes from this second round group. Jalen Wells has an outside shot of winning Rookie of the Year. That's how good he's been for Memphis. Kyle Filipowski has had some good minutes for Utah. Adam Bona has seen some minutes for Philadelphia. So there are definitely a few players that have stood out in their first year. But the fact that Bronny is 5th in points per game, the fact that he's averaging 25 and 5 his first year in the G League, granted in a small sample size, that's not nothing. And when you compare it to the rest of his second round draft class, it lines up pretty well. There are certainly players playing better than him, but there are also players playing worse than him. And I think that's the context that matters. So in the context of his first year, just based on stats, and again, I think eye test would back this up as well, Bronny James at least fits in with his second round draft class. He's not the best. There are certainly second round picks that are actually contributing in the NBA. But with how he's playing in the G League, there are certainly players playing worse. And so we're not trying to argue Bronny's the best second round pick. We're pretty much just trying to argue he's not the worst and that he belongs in this group. Based on stats, based on eye test in his first year, I think he certainly does. But we could also look at this from a longer term view. The fact that Bronny was picked 55th, what should we expect from him in his career? What is a good barometer for the 55th pick? Now, obviously, the scrutiny for him is always going to be higher because he is LeBron's son. But if you're comparing him just on his own to other picks in the 50s, how is he going to compare and where does he need to get to be a comparable second round pick? Now, there's a few ways you could look at this. You could look at past players that have been picked 55th, and people have gone through this exercise. But if you look at the last 10 55th overall picks, which is what Bronny was selected, you have names like Isaiah Wong, Gui Santos, Aaron Wiggins, Jay Scrubb, Kyle Guy, Arnoldus Kuboka, Nigel Williams-Goss, Marcus Page, Cody Lalane, and Samaj Kristen. Now, NBA fans would recognize a few of those names. I think none bigger than Aaron Wiggins, who's turned into a real rotation piece for the Thunder. Gui Santos has gotten some minutes for the Warriors. But other than that, it's a lot of maybe some NBA action to, in some guys' case, never seeing the NBA. And so if we're looking at 55th overall picks, at least of the last decade, the ceiling or the goal is someone like Aaron Wiggins. And again, Aaron Wiggins, really solid player for the Thunder, but that's the goal of the 55th overall pick. Now, let's kind of acknowledge that that's a little bit random, just looking at 55th overall picks from the last 10 years. There's no magic reason that the 55th overall pick would be any really different from the 56th overall pick, from the 54th overall pick. So what happens if we look at all the picks that were late in the second round? Because I think we can acknowledge not all second round picks are equal. Picks in the 30s are typically maybe some solid role players. Maybe they're star college guys that maybe are a little too old, or maybe just have certain flaws that NBA teams can't overlook. Think of a guy like Jalen Brunson. Picks in the 40s, that's where you get guys like Nikola Jokic. He's been maybe the best draft value of all time. You get some maybe overseas players. Maybe you take chances on some guys that have all the tools, but haven't really put it all together. And then picks in the 50s are kind of your long shots. These are kind of the last picks. And typically, picks in the 50s don't really turn out to much. Let's look at some past history of some picks in the 50s. And to ignore a lot of players that are probably still playing, let's look at the years 2010 to 2019. And let's look at a 10-year sample size of players picked in the 50s. And so if you look at from 2010 to 2019, every player picked between 51 and 60, which will count as in the 50s, there have been 100 players selected. Of the 100 players on this list, a lot of them did not even play in the NBA. In fact, 39% didn't play 1 minute in the NBA. And so Bronny is already past those guys. He's gotten some minutes his first year. So we can remove those 39 players. Of the remaining 61, 17 of them played less minutes in their career than Bronny James has already played in the NBA. And so we can remove those 17 players. And so then we're left with less than half of second round picks that we'll say played any sort of meaningful minutes in the NBA. And so then if you look at these remaining 44 players, there are certainly a few guys that stand out. If you sort all 44 players by win share, which is a somewhat reliable stat that can kind of boil a player's impact, how good they were in their career, down to a certain number. If you sort all the players by win shares and look at the top 10 players that have been picked in the 50s the last 10 years, number 1 is Isaiah Thomas. He's the most famous example, pick number 60. Second guy is Monte Morris, solid point guard, had a good few years. And then you get into names like Etuan Moore, Shake Milton, Jeremy Evans. Then you have Jalen McDaniels, not Jaden McDaniels. He was picked in the first round, Jalen McDaniels. Joffrey Laverne, Edmund Sumner, Abdel Nader, and then infamous Laker, Robert Sacre. And so those players that I just mentioned, everyone from Isaiah Thomas down to Robert Sacre, those guys are in the 90th percentile of picks in the 50s. Robert Sacre, who was a great player at Gonzaga, had, a nice NBA career. But most fans who know Robert Sacre wouldn't really call him an outstanding NBA player. And yet he is the 90th percentile of players picked in the 50s. And so all of that to say, it really boils down to this. Was Bronny James picked 55th because of his dad? Yes. But has he also shown real potential, at least based on expectation, based on where he was picked at 55th? Also yes. So who knows what Bronny's full career is going to look like? But if we look at it from the lens of him being a 55th pick and how he's performing early on in his rookie year, he definitely belongs in the NBA. He definitely belongs in the G League. Will he have a great career? Will he have major impact in the NBA? That's still a question. And yes, he is going to get a ton of scrutiny. He is always going to get scrutiny because of who his dad is. But if we remove all of that and if we just look at Bronny James, the player, based on how he is playing, it doesn't matter how he got into the NBA. He is in the NBA now, and based on how he is playing and how he has performed so far, he definitely belongs in the NBA.